Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on this cold day. We appreciate that. I'm Jenny Dyer. I'm the Executive Director of Hope Through Healing Hands, a global health organization based here in Nashville. It was founded and is currently chaired by Senator Bill Frist. We are excited to be co-hosting this event today with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Steve Morrison is here with us from Washington, D.C. He's the Senior Vice President there. He's a longtime friend and colleague, and Senator Frist has been sitting on the Board of Trustees there a number of years. We are also excited to have Vanderbilt Institute for Global Health co-hosting the event as well. We're going to open with a brief video from CSIS, and then we'll have Steve Morrison welcome the panelists. Thank you again.
Ebola is a modern-day plague tearing through Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. Thousands dead, thousands more sick, untold numbers of people at risk as the virus spreads at an exponential pace in countries with exceptionally weak health systems and poor leadership. Ebola threatens to enter neighboring West African states. Through international air travel, it has reached our shores. Senegal, Nigeria, and Spain. More may follow. India and China are also vulnerable, among others. Ebola leaped to Dallas when a Liberian man flew there in September, became ill, and later died. 2 nurses who treated Thomas Eric Duncan caught the virus. Luckily, each recovered. The drama in Dallas sparked fear and exposed readiness problems in U.S. medical facilities. It ignited controversy over what controls there should be over health workers and others exposed to Ebola here or while serving in West Africa. Debate intensified when an American doctor who treated Ebola patients returned to his New York City home from Guinea and became sick after circulating through the city. U.S. leadership is an essential element in fighting this complicated two-front war. At the source in West Africa, the fight is to break the chain of transmission and stabilize countries at risk of collapse. The U.S. military is deploying up to 4,000 soldiers to Liberia to expedite the construction of treatment facilities. It is the first ever U.S. military mission to battle an epidemic. U.S. military and civilian expenditures over the next 6 months will exceed $1 billion. A multilateral, region-wide effort is essential to bring the epidemic under control, save lives, and eliminate the export of cases. That means flooding the zone with doctors, nurses, and supplies, and establishing community-level care. It means establishing a viable UN operation that can lead into the future. At home, the fight is to protect U.S. citizens and ensure their safety, contain fear and panic without impeding the flow of essential American health workers into and out of West Africa. As we have seen, these two fronts can collide, leading to blunt confrontations between states and the White House, between governors and federal public health officials. As we head deeper into this uncertain two-front war, many questions loom large. Will it be possible to successfully isolate the sick, contain the spread, change burial practices, end the chain of transmission, and reduce the epidemic? Will it be possible to reach a coherent consensus on how best to protect Americans and advance our health objectives in West Africa?
Thank you all, and good morning. I'm Steve Morrison from CSIS. I want to offer special thanks to Jenny Dyer and Jane Lynch Crane from Hope for Healing Hands for organizing this, and to Bill Frist, a CSIS trustee, close friend, and co-founder of this HIV/AIDS task force that we established back in the end of 2001, which proved to be very pivotal in launching PEPFAR. I also want to thank Sten Vermund for allowing the Global Health Institute to be a co-sponsor here. We're joined today by also by Congressman Jim Cooper. Welcome, Congressman. Thank you for joining us here. For me, this is personally quite significant. Both of my parents went to Vanderbilt, and I grew up here as a kid. And it's just terrific to be back in Nashville and back on Vanderbilt campus. I'm going to offer some brief framing remarks, and then we're going to hear from Senator Frist, from William Schaffner, and from Sten Vermund, and we'll draw in some comments from other experts who are here today. Mukhtar Aliyoub, Jim Crow, ask Congressman Cooper to offer some comments, and we're going to open things up and hear from you, the rest of you all, as well. I think when you, in trying to capture where are we today with respect to Ebola, it remains a mixed and volatile picture. And I think it's a mix of both pride and optimism on one side of the equation, and some very hard lessons and some very good reasons to be cautious on the other side. So let me just quickly walk through that. There's been a lot of good news lately. This week, just yesterday, CDC announced significant reductions in infection rates in Liberia. The World Bank earlier this week announced that a re-estimation of the economic impacts down from a worst-case scenario of $33 billion by the end of next year to a $3 to $4 billion. Still a very serious consequence, but far less than what was thought earlier. Resources are flowing. The U.S. government has committed over $1.4 billion, the European Union 1 billion euros, the UK 300 million. The UN appeal is at about 2/3 of either delivery of monies or or pledges. At home, things have quieted a bit. We've had the successful recovery of a number of persons who became infected. The Craig Spencer, the two nurses, Amber Vinson and Nina Pham, the photographer Ashoka Mukfo, the three missionaries, Dr. Brantley, Nancy Whitebowl, and Dr. Sakra. 2 deaths, Thomas Duncan, and this week Dr. Scalia, tragic deaths, pretty timely reminders of the need for quick action and quick and accurate diagnoses of these cases. In terms of what are the sources of pride and optimism, I think that U.S. leadership in this period, accelerating in mid-September with President Obama's September 16th speech, is probably the most pivotal element of the international response. And it's been U.S. leadership at the executive level backed by strong bipartisan support within Congress. There have been debates, but like with the PEPFAR response, and I think we'll hear more from Senator Frist, our response as a nation has drawn on the well of goodwill and bipartisan cooperation that's emerged over the last decade, grounded in the HIV/AIDS, and also grounded in some of the earlier pandemic responses. We have, in very rapid order, projected American power into the region. Up to 3,000 troops now are to be deployed. We're a little over half that level today. USAID has set up an emergency operations center. CDC has sent 170 of its top experts into the field. Unparalleled, unprecedented commitment. At home, CDC has deployed over 700 staff towards the response, both domestic and international. There's been remarkable cooperation across agencies that are fraught with interagency tensions, and I think this is also a very good sign. NGOs, the non-governmental sector, has proven to be very, very pivotal in the quality of the response. The MSF, the Doctors Without Borders, are arguably the true heroes in this story. They got in early. They account for over 2/3 of the treatment and care. They have been courageous. They have over 3,000 employees and are serving hundreds. Christian missions have been very vital to the response. Samaritan's Purse, SIM, Dr. Brantley, Dr. Sakra, Nancy Whitebowl, they came home, they were cured, they survived, and they've remained very vital voices in the front face of the health worker response. Ken Isaacs, head of Samaritan's Purse in North Carolina, has also been very vocal and powerful. Others like the International Medical Corps, International Rescue Committee, Save the Children US have also jumped forward. Globally, there's been a big mobilization. At World Bank, IMF with U.S. leadership behind it, has come forward with very extensive facilities to cover emergency requirements. At the G20 in Brisbane last weekend, President Obama and Prime Minister Cameron were in the lead in building this into the communique and the actions. There's a lot happening on the technological side, and we'll hear more about this, in trying to move ahead very rapidly with the development of vaccines, with rapid tests, and with new therapies, and using emergency authorities. And we're seeing an exceptional level of cooperation today among regulatory agencies and industry. We've also seen a very encouraging and surprising mobilization of West Coast foundations, mostly rooted in the IT industry, that have not really played in this space, but have jumped in with quick dispersing money that now exceeds $200 million. Paul Allen, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Zuckerberg, Hewlett Foundation. Quite unusual, quite unexpected, and quite significant. The things that we need to worry about as far as hard lessons and reasons to be cautious, first of all, we're not out of the woods in this epidemic by any means. And that message has been carried through over and over again. I think we've learned at home that it's a very difficult task for us to prepare ourselves to deal with unexpected, sudden introduction of very lethal threats like Ebola. The experiences in Dallas and New York were, in some ways, quite disturbing. We had a lot of fear and panic. We had a lot of fragmentation of institutional responses. The November 4 election cycle, the media attention exacerbated a lot of those tensions. We didn't have clarity of policy around quarantining, and protocols were evolving as this was unfolding. There was no authoritative center to the approach. It was rather a rather fragmented approach. Our public health leaders have stumbled at different points. There's been a debate around how they need to retune the messages communicated to a public that is afraid. There have been criticisms of overconfidence regarding readiness, too much hubris, too much arrogance, too technocratic, and not enough sensitivity around public fears and lack of public confidence and trust in our public health system. For those workers that have returned, Craig Spencer, the doctor who was ill in New York, and Casey Hickox, the nurse, there has been a lot of debate around civil liberties versus just plain common sense and around public sensitivities and the need to be a little bit more vigilant about those public sensitivities. We're catching up rapidly on vaccines, on therapies, but I think one of the hard lessons in that is that a number of promising discoveries languished on the shelves for over a decade in some cases. We need a better system for addressing those. We allowed WHO, the World Health Organization, its emergency response capacities to decay in the last 3 or 4 years. The budgets were gutted, staff were gutted, and we missed this epidemic as it began to grow in the spring and into the summer. And one of the big questions, outstanding questions, is how are we going to repair that global capacity going forward? I think we're entering a period where there will be continued considerable ambiguity in this. The course of the epidemic remains still uncertain. Will it become endemic to coastal communities and rural communities? Will it spread to other countries? We now have it introduced into Mali. We still don't know about filling the health gaps, about getting skilled personnel in. As of this week, 570 health workers had become infected and 324 had died. That, along with all of the fears around quarantining and the like, is stifling recruitment efforts right now. There is a major ask in front of Congress, $6.2 billion, for this next phase. We'll see what happens. That action by Congress is expected before October 11th on the omnibus spending bill. So far, the deliberations around that have been quite promising. Thank you so much. I want to invite Senator Frist to come forward.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, and I'm going to just talk from here, but I think we can go to the podium if we would like to. But playing off Steve's comments a bit, what the Ebola crisis has done is answer two very fundamental questions that I, for the last 20 years, have tried to answer Jim Cooper is out there all the time answering it in his constituency here. Really, both questions. And the first question is, so what? Why does it matter? Why does what's happening in places like Sierra Leone or Ethiopia or Sudan, where I've spent a lot of time, why does it matter? That question is answered today by Ebola. It matters because viruses know no borders. Geography is sort of an independent variable that really doesn't mean very much. That the same little virus that has killed almost 6,000 people in Central West Africa is on our shores, is here. The second question that from a political standpoint you have to answer is, are we spending way too much, which is what many of the American people think. Are we spending way too much on global health? And they say that because the facts that they think of, or what their assumptions are, that we spend on average about 20% of our health care dollar on foreign aid, and about half of that, or 10% of our total budget, tax dollars, is being spent on health. And in truth, that's answered because for the first time people realize that in global health, from our budget, our global budget, national budget, our GDP, our budget, we spend about 0.1% of the taxpayer dollars. 0.1%. People think it's 10%. So both of those questions have really been brought to the forefront. It does matter. What matters around the world in terms of health matters to each of us in our own communities, whether it's New York City or Dallas, Texas, or Nashville, Tennessee. It's a real honor for me to be with this panel, and I'll keep my remarks short, but let me make a couple of points. Steve mentioned in 2001 we did a task force at CSIS, and it's pertinent in that was before what became the single largest commitment by any country, by any president, to fight a single virus, a single disease, and that was PEPFAR. CSIS, which is, most of you know, is a think tank, the Center for Strategic International Studies, really in about 1998 began saying, there are 1 million people, 2 million, now 3 million people dying a year of a virus. It's the time for our government to act, and they put together a panel that I was co-chair of, and John Kerry was the other co-chair. And the report that came out of this think tank ultimately became the platform that we used when President Bush made his announcement. That single commitment of $15 billion against this little cagey virus, a much cagier virus, by the way, that Bill will probably talk to than Ebola itself. At the time we did our report, there were about 10,000 people on what are antiretroviral agents, with a disease that was killing at that time about 3 million people a year. There were only 10,000 people. By the time we had PEPFAR passed, there were 50,000 people on antiretrovirals, and now 12.8 million people have access to those drugs. At the time, there were very few people getting voluntary counseling and testing, and today, for HIV testing and counseling, it's been given to 57 million people because of the leadership of the American people. We say President Bush, but it's really our government and it's the taxpayer who put it forward. I say that because now President Obama has asked for $6 billion in a very similar way to build the infrastructure that PEPFAR began, but PEPFAR was vertically oriented in terms of a virus and looked at malaria and tuberculosis a little bit, and now another $6 billion is on the table. So the U.S. has demonstrated global leadership, and we are demonstrating leadership today. The Department of Defense, USAID, the State Department, HHS, all are involved in a very, very aggressive way. No country in the world is doing more than the United States. There have been more than the 14,000 cases and over 5,000 deaths, still a huge issue, as we'll talk about today. About $1.23 billion has been promised so far. $415 million has been provided by the United States. The UN estimates are another $1 billion are needed to implement the most basic strategy out there. It's a five-fold strategy of, number one, stopping the outbreak, number two, treating the infected, number three, ensuring essential services, number four, preserving stability, and number five, preventing further outbreaks. So far, the response has been acute. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The forward-leaning response is really built into this $6.2 billion, which is part of the immediate response now, but also fortifying in support of the UN efforts, but also fortifying our domestic health infrastructure here, pursuing vaccines that we'll be talking about, and other therapeutics, and improving our capacity for things like rapid diagnostic testing. The point is we need to take the opportunity to respond to Ebola, because how we respond to Ebola today in large part is going to determine how we treat all infectious disease in the future, emerging infectious disease. So we got to get it right. And right now, getting it right means invest short-term, mid-term, and long-term infrastructure as well as response to diagnosis and treatment. Two things I just want to mention, because it is a time to look at game changers, and we need game changers to come through, disruptive innovation and the like. And two game changers, one's going to be vaccines we'll talk about, and Jim's going to talk about that in a little bit. The other is a rapid diagnostic test. It's current right now because we do not have a good in-the-field rapid diagnostic test. With HIV/AIDS, once we got a rapid diagnostic test in the field, it did all sorts of things in terms of breaking the person-to-person transmission, which is the real challenge that we have here. This is just a virus. If we contain the virus, if we quarantine the virus will burn out. So we need to treat this like any other virus, but we have a 21-day period when you're asymptomatic and the tests do not turn positive, even if you have the virus, until you're symptomatic, say 18 to 24 days. That's good that we have a test, but even that test is very difficult in the field. It's very expensive. It's not available for all the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are coming in. So we have to quarantine people for 21 days to wait till they're symptomatic, and then actually that's when the test will become positive. If we had a rapid diagnostic test that could be used in the field, that was inexpensive, that could give a very short, a very rapid response, it would turn around our overall quarantine policy. Much of the stigma would go away. Much of the reason people don't go into the clinics to be tested or to be quarantined, because they'll be kept with large groups of people. The benefits are really threefold. Number one, we'd have a fast and early quarantine to separate patients at risk. We know who's at risk, who's not at risk. Number two, if we had a rapid test, it would replace all the fear, all the stigma, all the anticipation with knowledge. You either have it or you don't have it. And number three, it'll allow us to have a much more efficient use of the quarantine resources that we have. Scarce resources. We don't have enough resources on the ground. You'd be able to use those much more rapidly. So with that, I'll stop my comments, but say it's a great honor for me to be a part of this panel, and we'll be happy to pitch back in with question and answers later.
We're going to swap.
Okay. Yeah, Sten, go ahead.
Well, it's a lot of fun for me to be in the field of global health. 30 years ago, I don't know if we would have had a panel where a political scientist and a cardiovascular surgeon would have had such a profound awareness of global health issues. And I want to commend both organizations, CSIS and also Hope Through Healing Hands, your vision of soft diplomacy is really a vision that I hope the United States embraces for a long time to come. We have been addicted to hard diplomacy for a long time, and I don't know what we've gotten out of some of our more aggressive international stands, and I don't know what the Soviet Union is going to get out of Crimea in the long run. But this notion that the United States' impact on the global community can be more profound when we use soft diplomacy, when you use disease control development, forgive me, disease control and development as tools for our own influence, positive influence in the world. Not everybody in the room knows what Ebola is. It used to be called Ebola hemorrhagic disease. And in early outbreaks for the past 20 years, hemorrhagic features, in other words, uncontrolled bleeding, were very prominent. For reasons we don't fully understand, hemorrhagic features in this particular outbreak have not been nearly as prominent, and I think we'll be calling this Ebola virus disease from now on. And symptoms are notoriously nonspecific. So fever, severe headache, and muscle pain, which are three of the most notable, are exactly three of the most notable symptoms for malaria. So it's very easy to mistake Ebola outside of an epidemic situation as Ebola. So when it crops up in Mali or in Nigeria, or for that matter in the United States, people might misdiagnose it. Fever, fatigue, and weakness are hardly specific to Ebola, but they're prominent features. And diarrhea, vomiting, stomach pain, of course, can resemble cholera. It can resemble gastroenteritis. Then if you do have the unexplained hemorrhage, of course, that's a giveaway. But as I said, not quite as common in this outbreak. And we know that symptoms can appear in a fairly broad 2-day to 21-day range, with a median probably in the 8 to 10-day range. And that's why you hear about quarantining the returning nurse in Maine for 21 days, because that's the outer limit of what we believe to be the incubation period. You can do much better with Ebola virus if you have modern medical care. Fluid and electrolyte balance is a critical feature of the management of Ebola, and it's tricky to manage diabetic ketoacidosis or severe gastroenteritis, or cholera is the most severe in a resource-limited setting. We are used to having our chemistries immediately available, our intravenous management, our blood pressure management. Sort of an ICU setting is absolutely optimal for this kind of care. And we're talking about 3 countries which are among the least capacitated in the world. The typical hospital in Guinea or Liberia or Sierra Leone may or may not have electricity that particular day. They may have running water in a tiny fraction of the hospital. They will not have running water as a routine part of the available infrastructure of every single hospital room. Clinics in the region will routinely not have electricity or running water. So it's hard for us to get our arms around how undercapacitated these 3 countries, which are all represented on the bottom 10 of the World Development Index of UNDP, and to appreciate how unprepared they are to deal with a complex medical problem. Now, the epidemiology has already been reviewed. There have been, as of yesterday, about 15,000 reported cases in these 3 countries, 10,000 laboratory, 9.5, about approaching 10,000 lab-confirmed cases, and over 5,000 deaths, and likely to reach 6,000. The entire rest of the world is about 14 cases. So that just puts it in perspective that the hysteria that we've seen about Ebola as a threat to American public health is not supported by the context of the current epidemic. We have an epidemic in 3 countries. We've had outbreaks in Nigeria that have been controlled, in Mali that have been controlled, in Senegal, and then we've had healthcare workers and travelers in the U.S. and Spain, and that's the extent of it. How would we want to control Ebola in Africa? Well, we need excellent care for the ill, and I've already told you the complexities there. Outstanding infection control strategies, and surveillance containment ring strategies. And what is this jargon that I've introduced? Surveillance containment. In the smallpox era, 50, 60 years ago, we learned that smallpox wasn't all that contagious. And if we could do surveillance and identify the hot spots, we could do ring containment and intensively vaccinate and restrict travel in these hot spots, and we could snuff out transmission dynamics. And we all think that Ebola is similar. If we had had a vaccine sitting on the shelf for a decade, and it had been tested and it had been deployable, we might have been able to apply this ring containment strategy. Now we're using less potent mechanisms, and you see how porous the quarantine strategy has been. It's very difficult to deploy a quarantine strategy in an environment with so little public health infrastructure. Nonetheless, it's been attempted, and we are relying on trying to do community work, having people identify sick persons, having them brought to the health facilities, because that can help restrict the patient pool from 6 to 1. So you have a choice. You get the patient out of the environment, reducing transmissibility to others, or you end up having a cluster of cases in the loving family that's caring for the patient, and they all get infected. So the notion of effective community outreach is perhaps the element of epidemic response that we've done most poorly. Then deployment into regional centers of excellence. We've done okay there, but we haven't had the resources to deploy holding areas. Because think about it, you have an Ebola patient, you want them in the hospital getting excellent care, but if you have an exposed individual who's been in intimate contact with the loved one, that person needs to be in a holding area. It's not particularly effective to send that person back to the village or to have that person mix with the Ebola patient. We've done a very poor job there. So there are a number of areas in which I think we can do better in the future, and Jim Crow will tell us about therapeutic options and vaccine options that we hope will improve our armamentarium in the response to future epidemics. Now, long-term control of Ebola has everything to do with health education, it has to do with vaccination, it has to do with health system strengthening. And it's interesting that the new ambassador, Debbie Birx, for PEPFAR, has actually cut the health system strengthening budget for PEPFAR. And there's been a radical shifting towards care and treatment because she believes that, in fact, for HIV control, care and treatment is going to be where she can show the greatest impact of her investment. And this health system strengthening thing is so vague and hard to define and hard to evaluate that she's thinking that may not be as good an investment. That frustrates me personally because I think of HIV the way I think of Ebola. I think of 20 or 30-year vistas. And unfortunately, so many of our political leaders and so many of our government officials are thinking about the 2-year, the 6-year span of their political lifespan or their time as ambassador, whatever they want to show an impact. It's hard for us in the United States to have the political leadership to think about a 20-year agenda. And that's where I think groups like CSIS and Hope Through Healing Hands, and for that matter, Vanderbilt Institute for Global Health, can be helpful. Now, how do we control Ebola in the United States? I think specialized containment hospitals like the ones we have at Emory in Nebraska are critical. Many of us heard an Emory professor speak at the Infectious Disease Society of America, and the level of complexity of managing the patient was so vastly beyond the ability of a functional community hospital like Texas Presbyterian to manage that it's foolish to even try. And it makes a lot more sense if we're expecting a handful of cases, even a dozen, even 2 dozen. That's a small number. And remember, in the United States, we've only had 4 cases. So if we is it 5? I have to check with my political scientist to get the exact number. I think it's 4. So the point is that makes no sense. To have every single health facility in the United States capacitated to cope with Ebola makes no sense. And to have these centralized, highly functioning hospitals, and if some fancy hospital X says, well, we want to be one of them, but we've already capacitated half dozen facilities, you tell fancy hospital X, no, you're going to stabilize that patient and transfer. So certainly we need information about disease control in our hospitals, but we should be transferring these patients to highly specialized facilities. John Dreisner, who is our Commissioner of Health here in Tennessee, should be commended for his efforts and his staff's efforts to reach out to the West Africa community, because what he did was mobilize State Health Department folks, and he worked very closely with Consuelo Wilkins at the Meharry Vanderbilt Alliance to convene doctors of West African origin who were in close contact, as well as community service organizations that serve West Africans living in the state of Tennessee, because he wanted, and his staff wanted, the drumbeat to be out there to ensure that if any returning traveler from West Africa was ill, that was probabilistically more likely a returning family or friend who was from West Africa, that we would know about it quickly and be able to deploy resources to benefit that individual as quickly as possible. Now, a final comment is the probability of a major outbreak in the United States is nil. Nil. There's no chance of a major outbreak. We're not going to be, now, we screwed it up in Dallas, certainly, sending a patient home. We've all seen we can do it wrong, but we can also do it right and reduce the risk of autochthonous transmission, person-to-person transmission here to really restricting it just to healthcare workers if we do it right. And I think we've learned a lot. And this feeding frenzy of criticism and hysteria from journalists, from major political leaders, maybe it has served its purpose. Maybe we've woken up and smelled the coffee that we can't be too arrogant in the public health field. We can't be too confident that we have all the answers, because we didn't do a particularly good job in this particular epidemic. So I think I'll leave it at there. I think the trust and public image of healthcare and public health have been tarnished a bit. I think we have a good opportunity to respond more effectively, and I think we've gotten a lot of lessons learned. Thank you.
So just a few words very quickly. Thank you again to the two organizations for sponsoring this. Let me put this just briefly into a larger perspective. The Ebola virus is a virus that lives in the wild. It circulates largely among African fruit bats, doesn't make them ill. The fruit bats are happy, and so is the Ebola virus. It occasionally gets into a great ape or into an antelope, and it lives there fine. It doesn't like to get into us. It doesn't have that intention, but it's when humans go out into Ebola City, into their environment, that they encounter the virus, and then when it gets into us, it causes serious illness. Population growth, habitat destruction, the consequent expansion of agriculture to support the population growth will repeatedly bring populations into contact with not only Ebola, but other zoonotic infections. And we will encounter these emerging infections from time to time, and reflect with me about what this last summer has brought us. First, we were concerned about MERS-CoV, that Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome virus that actually probably circulates in camels, gets into people, and threatened to come into the United States and the developing world. Then there was another virus, a virus that was in Africa and Asia, but suddenly came into the Caribbean, that some of us had difficulty saying, let alone spelling, chikungunya virus. Mosquito transmitted, could enter the United States. And then there was enterovirus D68. What is that all about? That suddenly swept across the country. And now we're talking about Ebola. And oh yes, it's getting a little chilly. And that re-emerging old friend, influenza, is about to come. And it re-emerges periodically in new forms from animal populations. So my theme is that emerging infections are ever going to be with us. They'll be with us in the future. They speak to the importance of maintaining a very strong, effective, sophisticated public health infrastructure, and for creating the environment where our scientists can anticipate and respond to them with appropriate therapies and vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Mukhtar Aliou to say a few words, and then Jim Crow, if you'd say a few words. And we'll ask Congressman Cooper to add a few words, and then we're going to open things up for comments and questions from the audience.
Okay, I'm going to make it short. Most of the comments I wanted to make have already been made by Sten and Bill and the folks on the panel. I think the key thing here is really what lessons the Ebola epidemic has already happened. It's already ongoing. The key thing is really what lessons can we learn from this epidemic, and how can we use these lessons to improve on our systems. So there are 4 or 5 key lessons, I believe, that would be important here. One is the role of health effective communication and health education. We need to have a system whereby we can ensure that simple, straightforward, honest communication that is culturally sensitive is provided to people who are exposed to these kinds of disease outbreaks. We saw the initial impact that some of the approaches had on the communities, whereby health workers were being kicked out of communities when they went to retrieve individuals who had Ebola. So that's an important lesson that we need to keep at the back of our mind. The second lesson is fragile health systems. Why did this epidemic outbreak become so big and so fearsome, so devastating? It's because at least 2 out of these 3 countries have had very fragile health systems. They've had ongoing conflict going on for years, and they don't have a system that is able to quickly detect a disease like this and put in resources and be able to tackle it. And the typical case is that of Nigeria. When Ebola, when the epidemic outbreak started in Nigeria, the few cases that we had there, because there was a system that was functional, a public health system that was functional, they were able to get on top of it pretty quickly. The third lesson is we do need to think about our healthcare workers. We need to ensure that we provide services that would protect our health workers so that they can provide safe and effective care to their patients. The lack of personal protective gear, the lack of proper training, all those had an impact, and all those contribute to the huge numbers of healthcare workers that we've seen affected by Ebola in these already resource-limited settings. Then the fourth lesson is that we've neglected research areas that are not what we perceive as not of high priority to us here. Diseases that we don't often see here in the developed settings are diseases that we don't often devote research resources to. But this epidemic has shown that any disease anywhere in the world is a potential threat to all of us. Because most of these countries, they are going to be the first line of defense if outbreaks like this happen. And if we don't have the science to back up the proper treatment and prevention of these diseases, then we will also expose ourselves. So those are the few words I wanted. I don't want to take up too long, but the key thing is really what lessons can we learn and how can we plan further ahead. This epidemic definitely is going to, it is very likely over the next couple of months we will be able to see at least a substantial part of it controlled. But the key lesson is what can we do down the line to prevent this from happening and strengthening the health systems in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukhtar. Jim Crow?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I just want to touch on vaccines so you know what's going on in that area. So in my lifetime, I see that there's been basically 4 phases of vaccines. One, when I was a kid, I got one of the first rounds of polio vaccine. So there was a large interest on common childhood infections, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio, and so on. And then in the early 80s with HIV, there was a big shift in our institute and the NIH to include HIV as a separate, did I turn the lights out? HIV was a dark period.
We're still in the dark about that vaccine.
So there was a splitting off, not only conventional targets, but to include HIV. And then when 9/11 happened, people said, wow, there's a lot of bad guys out there with bad germs, and we're not really working on those, and what are those germs? So there's been a list made of category A, B, C agents, a lot of bad germs on those. And I think to our government's credit, the NIH and the DOD and others started investing in low level, I would say. They're millions of dollars, but low level, $500,000 to groups to start working on vaccines for these things that aren't really in our country all the time, but could be. And I think the 4th phase now is we're realizing it's not going to be bad guys who squirt it on an airplane or drop it in Atlanta. Mother Nature is the terrorist here, and these things are already crossing over, as you've heard from animals, and as our society presses in deeper into these areas and come in contact with animals, and we have the transportation to spread it. Really, now we've stopped thinking so much about bioterrorism, biowarfare, but the same list is there, and we're now calling them emerging infectious diseases. So that's kind of the 4th phase. So DOD and NIH have been investing in vaccines. So where do vaccines come from? First, you take the germ. how does the germ make you sick, and then how do you kill it. That's just basic science work on how the germ functions. Then you make prototype vaccines, and you test them in animals, like small animals like mice typically. Then you start thinking about non-human primates, and you're talking about money then. Monkeys are expensive, and BSL-4 facilities are expensive. So now you're talking about millions of dollars. If you get that far, you have a promising candidate like we have now. There are two major vaccines that are being tested. One is like a cold virus, an adenovirus, that's been modified to express an Ebola protein. And the other is a veterinary virus, a virus that infects cows, and it's been modified and an Ebola protein put in there. And so these have been sort of validated in animal models, but at that point you have what's called a biotech valley of death usually. Things are on one side of a canyon, and they need $10 million to get to the next step, which is to manufacture this stuff in a clean place. You can't make this stuff in a place like a university. Also, the government does not manufacture things, so you need the commercial sector to put in about $10 million. And this is where all these things have been stuck, waiting for the partner to put in the $10 million to go from animals to the first in man. I think this is historically interesting because vaccines usually take about 25 years, but right here in front of us, we've seen things expedited over about a 3-week period from materials were ready to into clinical trials. The FDA, the companies, the clinical researchers has been an extraordinary time, and as a model, and you said we got to get this right, we're seeing the fastest we can do it right now. So there are, I think, 6 vaccine trials in the UK, United States, and in Mali, and these were all built on existing infrastructure that was pushed. So the fastest we can do it is what you're seeing. We ought to be able to do faster. And the last thing I would say is, why are we waiting around for $10 million to push something like an Ebola vaccine? And I think as a society we have to decide who's the market for this, who's going to buy this. So if a company puts in $10 million, who are they going to sell that to? And ultimately, vaccines can take typically $1 billion to $1.5 billion to get to the goal where we recommend them as safe and effective, and people should get them. So if this scales to $1 billion, who's going to pay that? And for Ebola, there is no commercial market. You're not going to buy an Ebola vaccine, probably. You're not going to take $100 out of your wallet and buy it and give it to a company who's manufacturing it on our behalf. So I think we're in a dilemma there that it's not a commercial market. So as a society, do we want to buy this for the world and for ourselves or not? And I think things get stuck, basically because of money and commitment. So I'll leave it there.
Jim, before you sit down, can you say a word about the ongoing efforts to resolve the indemnification problem for the industry? Because that's a very active subject right now.
Yeah, I don't know the resolution of that. So what Dr. Morrison is referring to is if something bad happens during a trial, a side effect happens, and there need to be resources put to the person or compensation, who's responsible for that? Is the company responsible? Is the government sponsor or the researchers? Typically, the companies have, in a conventional setting of vaccine development, the companies take on this risk. They have the commercial benefit down the line, and they take on the financial and the ethical risk. But the reason I think it's being discussed is there is no commercial benefit ultimately to these companies. They're going to do this at cost, basically. So that's another issue. Who should take on the risk? Yeah.
Maybe I could add something. 15 years ago, we had a very serious shortage of routine childhood vaccines in the United States because the number of manufacturers for a number of these vaccines had plummeted from 6 competitors to 2, and in some cases to a single vaccine manufacturer. And we didn't have enough vaccine capacity. And the reason is that the indemnification issue was actually relevant in the use of these vaccines. I mean, they were already demonstrated to be effective with minimal side effects. But minimal side effects doesn't mean no side effects. And if you had a 1 in a million adverse event and that person sued for a very large amount of money, then that company might lose a big chunk of its profit margin. And there were a number of companies that literally went out of the childhood vaccine business. And we created a fund. It's government sponsored, but it's funded by extra fees on vaccines. And you can be reimbursed for a side effect from a vaccine without going through a judiciary system and without a company admitting fault, because the situation is overwhelming benefit, rare harm. In the cases of the rare harm, you reimburse, you compensate the affected individual. That's worked pretty well, but that's in the context of a very large market. And as Dr. Crow said, we don't have a large market when the poorest countries of the world are the ones who are purchasing it. But that model that we've used it successfully in our own country, one could think about models that would be a little analogous. Taxes on certain products to subsidize costs for these so-called orphan products. Orphan meaning there isn't a company that wants to sponsor them because they're not going to make any money out of it.
Now, we know that the U.S. response and the overall global response is expensive. We've made a commitment to deploy upwards to 4,000 troops. It's now projected to be about 3. There was urgent action taken in collaboration with Congress in the fall to get an initial approval of reprogramming of $750 million upwards to $1 billion. It's now the expectation is it's going to be close to that $1 billion mark. There's now a request for $6.2 billion under active consideration. Congress plays a critical role in all of this, and preserving a bipartisan consensus in a period when, as we saw with the President's speech last night, things are heating up again, and we, of course, had the November 4th election cycle, which is shifting power. Congressman Cooper, could you offer some thoughts?
Well, thank you. I'm the only non-expert you'll hear from today, but I do get to vote on some of these things. My first wish is that Bill Frist were still Senate Majority Leader. That would make things a lot easier. First of all, a minor correction. The testimony we had this week on the Armed Services Committee is the $1 billion already allocated. The Pentagon hasn't drawn down nearly as much as they expected. So they're currently at the $200 or $300 million level. So that $750 million may last more than we thought. Hopefully the epidemic will subside. On the larger funding request, there are many factors involved, but one of them is procedural that most people probably wouldn't think of. If this is a standalone vote, it has a chance of being much more controversial than if it's rolled into a much larger measure, whether that's an omnibus appropriations bill or a continuing resolution. Because if it's part of a larger measure, then the vote is on whether to continue government. And we've learned twice now that it's probably a good idea to keep government going. Shutting it down is seldom an effective strategy for anybody, no matter how angry you are. But if it's not included in one of those larger measures and is standalone, that exposes the vote to a lot of other political pressures, and each member is different, and I can't presume to speak on behalf of any of my colleagues. But right now, if I were guessing, in the Tennessee delegation with 9 congressmen, there are probably only 2 sure votes for the package, and I would be one of those. The other votes are much less predictable. There are some of my colleagues who've never voted for anything having to do with anything foreign, period. They're against it. And Bill Frist alluded to some of those reasons earlier. Other folks would be against it because Obama was for it. That's equally nonsensical approach, but that's what sells back home. And you have to realize, too, that senators, when they vote, are usually much more sensible than House members, because senators have to vote representing an entire state, whereas House members with gerrymandered districts only have to represent a very narrow slice of the electorate that's been pre-selected to have views that are either deep red or deep blue. I actually represent the only swing district that's left in the state of Tennessee, here in Nashville. So when a House member is wondering how to vote on a standalone measure, $6.2 billion that looks like foreign aid or health infrastructure in countries that their constituents will never visit, never want to visit, wouldn't let their kids visit, that's the tragedy that we face, because in a globalized era, these are, as Bill Frist said, these are our issues. These aren't somebody else's issues. And the best way to contain the epidemic is to contain it in West Africa. So we'll see in December. The session will be very short. The new Republican majority in the Senate will not want a Democratic chairman to continue to hold the gavel for any more minutes than is possible. So it'll be rushed through. And to give you an idea of the fragility, The one sure bill that passes every year is the Defense Authorization Bill. It's passed every year for 52 years, no matter what has been going on politically. This year, it may not pass. So that's how fragile things are. So I would hope the aid package would be part of the larger measure. You know, it's either you're for government or against government, not a standalone measure. If it is standalone, well, then the Vanderbilt community will have a lot of work to do to reach out to folks, certainly in the Middle Tennessee area, but all across the country, to try to make sure that people vote the right way.
Thank you very much. We'd like to welcome you all to come forward and offer some thoughts and comments. What I suggest we do is bundle together 3 or 4 comments and remarks, and we can start right up here. We'll bring a microphone to you. Please identify yourself. We'll bundle together 3 or 4 and then come back to our speakers.
I'm Professor Doug Perkins at Peabody College. Professors Vermund and Aliyu both spoke to the problem of the need to strengthen the public health systems in the poorest of the less developed countries. I want to ask about a key aspect of that, and that's the problem of medical brain drain from those very same countries to the West, including especially to the United States. And I would invite anyone to respond to this, but especially the political side of the panel, because as was mentioned, we had the President last night speak to immigration reform, and my understanding is one aspect of that, as much as I agree with most of it, is actually contrary to the need to keep trained medical personnel in place in those countries.
Thank you. Yes. Here.
Dave Vreeland with Cumberland Consulting Group. I'm curious about a comment you made, Dr. Vermund. I think that those of us who are interested in this topic might remember the outbreak from the early mid-'90s that I think largely because of some of the horrific aspects of the symptoms stimulated books and movies. There was a Dustin Hoffman movie, et cetera. I'm curious about your comment about the symptomology being different this time around than it was 20 or so years ago, and if you can comment at all further on why that might be.
I'm Sam Opaku, Director of the Center for Cultural Health and Society. I'd like to thank the panel for their interest and contribution to this area and distress in West Africa. I just have a question for the panel, though. What do you suspect might be some of the cultural barriers to preventing spread of this illness? Thank you.
Do we have any other interventions at this point? Right here.
Hi there, Ashley Gish with the United Methodist Church's effort of Imagine No Malaria. We're working tough to fight malaria, and we heard that the symptoms are very common between Ebola and malaria. So how can organizations that are working on other diseases of poverty, especially those that have similar symptoms, respond in these 3 countries, especially being sensitive to the safety of our professional and volunteer health workers?
I'll just take one of them, and we can cover them all. The cultural issues are fascinating, and it's not that different than HIV/AIDS was in terms of the stigma, the response, the cultural response, the natural cultural response, the reality of people from the West or from the United States coming in, changing cultural practices which are embedded, which define who a people are, but are counter to what we know in science. And so I say HIV/AIDS was similar, but I'll just jump to Ebola. Ebola, as all of you know, right now is not that, it's a deadly virus, but it's not that contagious of a virus. Right now, if I had Ebola, if I were symptomatic, nobody would be infected. If I were symptomatic, nobody would be infected. I have to actually have to cough and have to have bodily fluids transfer and hit. So it's not that contagious. But it is contagious when your death practices, cultural death practices of somebody who has died, who at that point are shedding virus at the most sort of profusely, not early on, not when you're asymptomatic, not when you just have a little bit of fever, but at the time of death when the viral load is high as possible. and where the touching and the kissing of death, which is part of the culture of many areas of the world, that is part of the culture. How do you break that? Because that is death, the most intimate moment, that step between life and death and eternity. You're basically coming in and saying, no, you cannot do that. That strips the dignity of people. The healers, or the medicine men, depending on where you are the people who, and there was an article in the New York Times or somewhere yesterday or 2 days ago really talking about that, are the point people, and whatever the religious faith people are, they're going to be more effective than people from the West or white coats or USAID coming in. Totally ineffective. And that's where the focus has to be. And it is soft. It is science-based, but it is soft. But must be done when we know the virus is not, it's a deadly virus, it's not especially contagious, but when the culture itself is part of the contagion and the spreading. And it's one of the reasons in this particular case that it's been hard to stop. Ultimately, quarantine culture, science can still play a role. Rapid diagnostic test, if I came in and could basically say at a point in time that you have the virus, we don't know the natural history of the virus, whether or not it goes away in somebody before they're symptomatic. But if we could clearly identify from a scientific and predict who is going to get it, who is not, who has it, and pull that out, it is much easier to go into a culture and say separation from family, separation from others, rather than this soft thing, well, you got a little bit of fever, and the likelihood it's probably not going to be Ebola, but you're going to have to leave your family. Again, a cultural nexus with science where science can drive, but the transmission needs to be peer-to-peer, people-to-people, and the culture has to change within. And it starts with the medicine men and the traditional healers.
Sten, Bill?
Well, I would just reinforce everything that Bill has just said. Burial practices are terribly embedded in traditions and cultures. They go back thousands of years here as well as there. Exactly what Bill has said. At that point in illness and in death, the person is essentially a test tube full of Ebola virus. And indeed, Ebola, which has the capacity to actually get into most organ systems, including the skin, that person becomes then highly infectious. And the reverential bathing practices that are done become highly contagious to others. So trying to educate people to that point that this is now no longer appropriate because of hazard to others is very difficult. So you have to do an awful lot of social communication and engaging people in ways that they begin to understand this hazard in a population that somehow is remote even from the concept of the viral transmission of disease. And just very quickly, to make the point, we've just had a reintroduction of Ebola into Mali from Guinea. And the reason is that an imam passed away of Ebola, and the population, although having received some information about the hazard of funeral practices, nonetheless, in this most reverential circumstance of an imam's death, went through the traditional practices, which of course have now created a small cluster of transmission around those practices and the funeral arrangements. So it's very difficult. You have to try to get into the culture with local people who can then communicate to others.
Can I just add one thing to this? In the three focal countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, I think we were caught off guard in the early phases of this. The first case that was confirmed was March 24th in Guinea. It really wasn't until the June-July timeframe when the alarm bells started going off from MSF. Why was it hidden in that period? One of the reasons it was hidden was the epidemic was driven underground deliberately through people who did not trust their government agencies and who were actively evading them. So you had burial practices as one vector of transmission. You also had deep distrust and skepticism around governing structures that were driving people to go the other direction. lately what we've seen is one very promising development, which is the proliferation of burial teams, particularly in Liberia. The numbers have grown 50 a week over the last couple of weeks. And the announcement by CDC yesterday that there had been a proven significant drop in the infection rate was tied, I think, significantly to the proliferation of these burial teams with the support of elders, with the support of community leaders, explaining that these, in fact, were not alien, they were not going to be accelerating the death of people, and that they would be treating the population with dignity and with sensitivity. And that is working.
And to get even more nuanced, the acceptance of the burial teams, as different as that was, is more acceptable than cremation. So it gets to be very, very nuanced.
Anyway, it's a great question, and it shows that no matter how good the science is, how much money is spent, if it needs the real answer has to rise from the culture itself, and we need to promote that. We need to understand that we can't dictate it. Let's go through these other questions because I've forgotten what they were. But the manpower one, huge. Two things. In all of Liberia, before this happened, there were only 45 doctors in the whole country, Liberia. So, and that's true in many countries. I just was in Cuba for 10 days. It's not true there. There are doctors everywhere, and they are exporting doctors everywhere. And Fidel Castro had it right in terms of healthcare diplomacy. Wherever you go in the world, there are Cuban doctors, and people love them. And so you'll hear us in Hope Through Healing Hands use medicine as a currency for peace, and it's real. Health, hope, healing, it goes together. We need more out. Health workers are a way to do that. That's number one. Number two, it's kind of flips it on its end. Doctors really aren't what's needed. It's community health workers. And community health workers, because this is where Cuba is much better than the United States, and much of the developing world is much better than the United States. Community health workers are kind of regular old people who get specific training, culturally appropriate, who go in, and they're responsible for identifying the contacts. And if there's somebody who's a contact, talking to them, and this doesn't take a doctor to do, and saying, come with me and we'll talk about the best way to do it. And so it's not necessarily the doctors themselves. And so when I look at aid coming in from the outside, the first place I go are programs that support community health workers, not so much the doctors and not even the rapid testing that I talk about and the vaccines and the treatment. If we want to stop this thing, it's community health workers. They're health workers, but they're people like regular people who have an interest to spend a few days, and that's what we need in terms of the human capital, I think, today, not just here, but we talk about maternal health, mother-to-child transmission of other diseases, everything out there. The United States fails miserably. We like doctors, and we like nurses, and we like licensing, and we like states to regulate it, and that's why our costs are high, our access is bad. We got to get over it and have appropriately trained people inserted where it's needed in this country as well as in Liberia and Sierra Leone.
A transplant surgeon advocating for barefoot doctors. It's an event.
The question around making use of the malaria capacities.
Okay, what was it?
Was asked about how to leverage that capacity.
Primary care is primary care. If you are on the front lines and you are assisted in expanding your algorithms, rather than thinking about malaria, you can also think about Ebola. Rather than thinking about cholera, you can also think about Ebola. So it is part and parcel of what we've been talking about the community outreach, is the outreach to our medical professionals. We've been helping the local Methodist leadership to develop health education materials for their very extensive network of ministers, teachers, and healthcare workers in West Africa, because the Methodists are especially active in Liberia, and they have penetrative reach into many rural areas of that country. And they were not empowered with culturally appropriate educational materials, so we identified one of our adjunct faculty, Richard Nisbet, who has been working in Liberia for the past 2 years and on the faculty of Tubman University. And he and I pulled together materials from the CDC and World Vision and a variety of other sources, and then recrafted them to be Liberia sensitive, sent them to pastors and nurses in Liberia for further editing, and have deployed educational materials that are going to reach out into this community. So we're hoping that as someone thinks, oh, you might have malaria, they'll think you might have Ebola. And this is a very suitable feature. Remember that transportation of the ill patient to a health facility can reduce substantially the risk to that community. Taking the infectious individual into a healthcare setting will provide some benefit. Now, you do need some training to engage a patient, protect yourself. We learned from Texas Presbyterian that even standard education around gowning and gloving isn't adequate. And what the experts will tell you is you need training in degowning and degloving, because that's where the surgeons and the nurses are done with surgery and they rip off the clothing and the gloving and the masks and throw them in the bin. You can't do that with Ebola. You need to be much more cautious about the degowning procedure, and that kind of thing can be taught. It's not rocket science. You can have technical experts who observe the gowning and degowning procedure, and it can be driven to other healthcare workers. It doesn't have to be a doctor or nurse doing that, although we've had considerable success with nurses in particular providing that oversight. Yes. Did we touch on the hemorrhagic feature issue? Can I just say one word about that? So it is a great mystery as to why the condition seems to be less hemorrhagic now than it was before. But I don't want you to overinterpret what I said. There are plenty of hemorrhagic cases. It is still a hemorrhagic fever.
But you're right. People don't die of that.
Yeah, it's been less frequent than in these smaller outbreaks in previous years.
It's a hemorrhagic disease, but all those movies, people are bleeding to death.
Yeah.
These people are not dying of that.
Right.
They're dying of hypovolemic shock.
That's right. Yeah.
And what the does that take care of all those questions?
Well, I was just going to make one tiny point, which is it's possible that there's a paradox, that the more virulent the virus, the faster it infects in a community and the less it spreads, because people are dying very high rates. If you have a little less in hemorrhagic case and a little less virulent, you may have greater spread.
And the question is why.
It's a question mark.
It's a different strain. That's why. That was the question. We take too long to answer it. All right.
Why don't we take another round of comments and questions? We've got several hands up over here. We've got a few over there. Yes, please.
Great. Dr. Vermund, this is Stephen Kahn of the Abundance Foundation. Vermund, you mentioned about how even within PEPFAR, funding is being cut for healthcare capacity building because it's the data for that often is a lot longer to see those kinds of results. How do we utilize this epidemic to make sure that the attention stays on what the real culprits of this epidemic were, of just such a weak health infrastructure in the first place?
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Tad Lasella, retired nurse practitioner. And I have two questions. First of all, is there a chance that this virus would mutate to be contagious in a respiratory way? Secondly, what do you think of travel restrictions?
Pardon me?
Travel restrictions.
Travel restrictions. What does mutate travel restrictions? Good. Okay.
Okay.
Did you have a question, Andrew? Keep going.
Two quick questions on diagnostics. What's the current state of the art, and what are its shortcomings, and what seems to be the best thing on the horizon in rapid diagnostics?
Sure. What else?
Pertaining to culture, even in the U.S., so I'm Elliot McKinley, I'm a postdoc here at Vanderbilt. In the U.S., there seems to be a profound scientific illiteracy among the population, and the media in this whole thing did not help things. And politically, maybe it was just the election going on, but you had members of Congress saying that Ebola was airborne, which obviously is not helpful, or Ebola is going to come across the border with illegal immigrants, or ISIS was going to import Ebola. or you had a senator who's a doctor saying you could get Ebola in a cocktail party. I just know if there's any comments about that going on here.
Okay. Do we have any others? All right. So we've got a question here about PEPFAR cuts. That was to Sten.
I'll take the
Question
respiratory.
on mutation and travel restrictions. And on the diagnostics, maybe Jim and Bill.
All right, that's good.
Scientific illiteracy.
You want to go in order? Let's go. Jim, do diagnostics. That's fine.
Okay, so diagnostic test, basically you take a blood sample and you do a molecular biology test that takes a few hours. It takes a highly trained person with a relatively expensive machine and a lot of containment so you don't contaminate and get a false positive. What people want, what's being worked on right now, are rapid tests where you can take a drop of blood, put it on a little strip, like a strep test that you would get for strep throat. So there's a lot of that development going on, and it'd be great if you could do it on urine even. So something easy to get, but it's probably going to be a drop on a little device, and there's a lot of development around that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is the FDA, go back to the FDA. First of all, we'll have a vaccine within 12 to 15 months. I don't know if you guys will agree, but I predict we'll have a vaccine. The vaccine is easy. Unlike AIDS or the HIV virus is changing all the time, we may never see a vaccine. This one is not changing very much. The proteins are easy. And once you have the vaccine, it's not a live vaccine, so it's safe to get and all. So the vaccine stuff, I think, is going pretty well. It'll be at 12 to 15 months. The FDA needs to speed things up, but they're working very hard. They've approved 2 rapid assay tests today, but they're very expensive. They say 2 hours. You still have to draw blood with so whoever the phlebotomist is, remember that's the only way you're going to get it is that blood handling directly. So the 2 that have been approved quickly through a fast track are totally inadequate. What we need is exactly what Jim says, a field, ideally on a drop of blood in the field, minimal contact with it, that immediately will give you, not only after you're symptomatic, but ideally before you're symptomatic at day 3, 4, 5, or 6, and then you can know where to quarantine people throughout. FDA is doing a good job. They're right now looking at 13 different tests today. They're working very hard. You say, why can't you do it immediately? Just take some time. And the vaccine, I think the FDA is doing a pretty good job now on the fast track today.
That's for sure. So as regards mutations, the answer is easy, no. Put that out of your mind. That's not going to happen. That has not happened in the history of everything we know about RNA viruses transmitted in one fashion, mutating to be able to be transmitted in another. That won't happen. Travel restrictions, that's a very interesting question. It's a needle in a haystack issue, but there were 2 epidemics. One is the Ebola epidemic, and then there was the Ebola mania epidemic, which is just as real. It's just as real. You have to deal with it just as seriously, and that's above the pay grade of the doctors. From the public health point of view, travel restrictions don't add much safety. From the point of view of public perception and reassurance, it provides a great deal of reassurance.
Just 2 things on the travel. I'm totally against the travel ban. I just think we need to have very strict screening come in. It has been modeled, and at least modeled with smallpox, it has a negative impact if it's really sophisticated model. Just 2 other things. There are no direct flights from this part of the world to the United States, period. So by definition, you're going somewhere, which means if you're going to put a travel ban, you're shutting down airports from all over the world. Number 2, 60% of all the people who travel back and forth are legal residents of the United States of America. 60%. No health workers are going to get in there. No nurses are going to get in there. And so it is terribly destructive. And there are a lot of, when it comes to this whole political question, there are a lot of political figures out there who, because it is a real, obviously if you shut down the world and we say the virus has to be transmitted, it's right. It's like saying nobody's going to drive a car in America itself. This political literacy and all, it is a huge problem. When I went to the United States Senate in 1994, there were no physicians in the United States Senate and no physician in the United States Senate since 1928. And so that's changed. I sort of broke through a ceiling there. But the scientific literacy is something that I struggle with as a scientist there, and we need to keep pushing. And unfortunately, it feeds a lot of the panic, which is real in America and the public perception. And the only thing we can do is go back and look at the science. Remember, we're fighting the virus. We're fighting a disease. We're not fighting each other. We're not fighting political battles here.
Yeah, don't misunderstand me. I was not in favor of the travel restrictions. Don't misunderstand.
This question around health systems and whether this crisis creates an opportunity to revisit this. We've seen plenty of evidence that now it is a legitimate and priority issue for debate. Sten?
You mentioned scientific illiteracy. Part of scientific illiteracy is public health illiteracy. And it's actually quite shocking in the United States how casual we are about deteriorating waterworks, sewage systems, bridges, roads. We are not aggressive in revitalizing our own preventive elements in our own infrastructure. So it doesn't surprise me that we are somewhat blind to needs of low-income countries where we don't see any particular strategic advantage making that investment. Even when we do see a strategic advantage, Afghanistan's a good example, Iraq's a good example, our investments have been so mismanaged that we have largely seen half-built sewer systems, half-built water systems, roads to nowhere, and this sort of thing through a variety of issues of mismanagement. So I do feel like the United States should do a little less patting itself on the back for all of its brilliance in investment and be a little more self-critical and self-evaluative about its public health infrastructures in its own backyard and recognizing exactly what the panelists have highlighted, which is that the best way to control this epidemic is to go to the country of origin and help that country capacitate in basic primary care infrastructures so that this disease and a dozen other diseases will not find its way to American shores.
I think we have to learn better how to communicate with the general public. This is a very subtle issue. Hard to transmit virus that can make you very sick. How is it actually transmitted? And it's transmitted as a hazard differently early in the illness than it is later. This is very, very difficult. We've talked to the general public about body fluids being hazardous, not wanting to say vomit and diarrhea. So that the questions I get are about the 4 S's. Saliva, sneezing, sweat, and sex. None of which really, except maybe sweat in the already dead person, really have anything to do. But in the mind of the general public, that's what they're concerned about. That's what concerned, of course, people who were on the subway the same time Dr. Spencer was on the subway. They were exactly at 0 risk, but that was very concerning to them. So we need to be able to communicate in a much more clear fashion. That said, our means of communication are not set up to have reasonable, sustained discussions. I mean, we had our friends from the local media here during this session, but try to get in more than a sentence with the local media. I mean, sound bites get ever smaller. It would be lovely to be able to have a circumstance where you could actually speak a paragraph and, goodness sakes, maybe even 2 in order to explain a very subtle concept.
Senator Frist, would you like to close our session here? We're at the end of our hour.
Bill Schaffner, just on the communications end of it, is a pro at it, and everybody knows it from the community here. Bill Snyder, who's not in the room now, was probably the best medical reporter here in Nashville for 10 years. What did you say, Jim, in terms of articulating it? This question about communication of science in a world where science is increasingly important to our everyday lives for all sorts of reasons is a real challenge, and it's a real problem with with reporters not being able to specialize as much with speaking in 128 characters and texting and all. It's a real challenge. We need to figure out. Vanderbilt has a really big role there. I think Peabody does. I think we as a local community do, because healthcare is so prominent here. The purpose today is really to reflect a bit, share with you where the Ebola virus is today, both in the short term in terms of immediate response from a scientific perspective, so you'll understand and we'll all be able to share what we know about vaccines, about rapid diagnostic testing, the importance of infrastructure, the fact that this is a teachable moment. It's a teachable moment in history that we had with HIV/AIDS. We responded to it as a nation very well in terms of PEPFAR, bipartisan support coming in, changed the course of history. 10 million people alive today who would not be alive if leadership, political leadership, did not articulate, engage, and act. So as bad as people think politics is and gridlock, and I hate it, and I say, oh, it was so much better when I was there, but it really wasn't that much better. Politics is important, and policy is important, and it can change the course of history. And so it doesn't really matter who the president is, but at a point in time. But an example is we do have a president who's asked for something now that makes sense, at least from our standpoint. And again, policymakers have to figure out how to pay for it, but that's what we pay them to do. So it's a good issue. It's an issue that right now Ebola is going to be out here for months and months and months and months. The vaccine, the science is going to be out there. So stay informed with it. You've heard the state of the art today. You have a think tank represented who has specialized in global health, the premier think tank in the United States of America, CSIS, sponsoring today. You have a private foundation that many of you contribute to directly and indirectly, Hope Through Healing Hands, which Jenny and several of us in the room have worked on for the last 10 years with the support. And we do reflect the faith-based community, people on the ground, human capital. We've sent 70 scholars overseas for a period of time. So the human capital, we're doing our best with that, working with Vanderbilt and Lipscomb and Belmont and others here. In terms of the clinical application and the science which Bill represents in terms of the state of the art where we are, but also I'll have to couple his real leadership and communication. Right now, we saw it with SARS, we saw it with anthrax, which we lived with when communication was a big issue 2 months after the World Trade Center went down. Again, it's a recurrent theme, but then we have a responsibility. What is Vanderbilt's role in training people and journalists and other universities as we come through, as well as our physicians, people like Cole Barfield, who was in this room training for 8 years. That's where the answer is. It's not with a bunch of us up here who've sort of been through it all. So I want to thank the entire panel. Jim, thank you from the scientific standpoint for everybody taking time. We're all available, and it'll be actually interesting to do something like this again 6 months from now. So, Steve, thank you for your leadership as well in coming down from Washington State. Thank you all. If you have any questions, let us know. Appreciate it.